setting. So my classroom doesn't look like everybody else's classroom. I have lots of students doing lots of different things at the same time. And I'm currently working with young moms. So that's my day-to-day work. But I have been taking meaningful notes with my students for about 4 or 5 years now. And so it's something that I feel really passionate about, and it's the only way that I get my students to take notes. And I've tried lots of different things over the years. So that, at least for me, I know Laura does something really specific, but I've tried a bunch of different ways to do this, and I'm going to say that most of them work, and it just depends on the student in terms of the medium in which they're actually creating their note. It's more what you do with the note and how you frame the note that's the important thing. So yeah, so usually, I mean, obviously they have to have learned something. And then I give them a couple of ways that they can maybe create their note. So it could be taking a picture of their whiteboard and then annotating it on maybe on the computer. They could create a whole new note on their whiteboard and annotate it. They could write in their notebook. They can write on the computer. They pick what they want to do. And so because my students are working individually, some years I'll have tons of people working on the computer. Some will be, oh no, I like my notebook. I've done this, whatever, great, use your notebook. It really doesn't matter. But then I always phrase it like, okay, you're making this note for yourself. You're making it for yourself a few weeks from now, when you probably have forgotten about most of the stuff that you did today. And this is what you're gonna use to help yourself the next time you do it. So that's the way I frame it. And then I guess the most important thing, which I highlighted in orange in my notes, which I made for myself so I can remember to talk about everything. You have to do that then. You have to actually go back and do something else with it later so that they're actually using their note, because if you don't, then there's no point to it. So if the students know that they're going to be going back to their notes a few weeks later, they actually care about what they do with them. So that I think is probably a very, very important thing. Then I'm cueing them the next time that they see it. So what do you remember about last time we did something with triangles? Maybe you could look in your notes and see what you wrote about them. And then that's what they're using to start what they do. And if the note doesn't properly jog their memory, maybe they didn't put the correct reminders the first time. Maybe they didn't figure out exactly what they really needed to know about that thing. And so at that point, they're actually going in and messing with their note again. So once they've done it again, oh yeah, I didn't write this. I need to be careful with my negative sign or whatever. Like they need to go in and write that again. I also do it after they've done an assessment. If they still didn't get the same concept, okay, well, look, what mistake did you make here that you that you're recognizing now that maybe you can also add into your note for next time? Because again, if they're seeing the material again and again, they still have another chance to understand it and to get it right. If they're learning an extension that's big enough to make a change to their notes, then they again are going back and adding to them. So that's like I think the process is way more important than physically what they're actually what they're creating through the process is important. The exact way that they go about doing it, I don't think matters exactly. Then I wrote down a few things that like over the years I've had like pitfalls. So making enough time to do the notes, really important. So sometimes you get going on something and then you don't have enough time to consolidate at the end of the class. And it's so easy to just keep going and move past it, but it's so important. So if that happens to me, what I'll do is the next day, maybe get them to do one more problem on the same kind of topic, a shorter one. And then after that, like everything's kind of been reactivated, then they go back and they make their note in the middle of the class, and then we go on to something else after. So it's a way, because I usually love to do it, at the end of the lesson, but sometimes the timing doesn't work out that way. And so that's a way I've found of getting around that so that the note actually does get made. And I definitely had like a student this year that like, there were a few times, okay, you need to really write down your note for whatever. And she just kept on finding ways around it, or things just kept coming up. And so we just had to eventually sit down, and she did it. It was fine. Yeah, and so I guess the most important thing is to get them to use their notes as intended, so as a guide for themselves later, not just studying for a test. That's not the point of them. It's to activate their knowledge when they're solving a problem. And if you keep circling back to it and back to it and back to it, that's where it becomes the most useful thing that they have. Yeah, so that's what I wrote down about my notes about notes, which is kind of fun. But Laura and I are keeping it pretty casual tonight. So she's going to talk about what she does, and then we like talking about notes. We both also love sketchnoting. I just remembered that's something that both of us like. So yeah, we love talking about notes. So we'll be answering your questions too. Yeah.
Awesome. So I gotta see if I know how to use Zoom and share my screen. Oh, share screen. Let's try this.
And yes, you totally can incorporate it into a portfolio. I'm seeing that at the bottom.
Awesome. All right. Can you guys see the screen okay?
Yeah,
I'm a Google Meet girl, so Zoom scares me a little bit. So yeah, I sort of developed, and I'll say, like, I was a tried and true modeling after my own math teacher's chalk and talk teacher before learning about the thinking classroom and some other shifts at the same time that were going on. I meticulously prepared my notes that I then put on chalkboards for my students to then copy word for word into their notes. That was very important. That was like the chunk of our lesson time. This is, it's very different for me to give, and I'm very A-type, so giving the responsibility to the students. And I know this was actually our chapter in our book club on Monday of last week. So if you go back on Twitter a couple of days ago, you'll find people discussing this same topic. And there's definitely that reluctance to sort of let the students decide, because maybe that means the notes aren't as good. And I was surprised to realize that I actually got pretty okay with that over time, given my A-type personality. And just, I knew we were doing such great problem solving that it didn't bother me so much. But so how I structure meaningful note-taking in my class is to create what I called course packs. And so I'll sort of scroll down here so you can start to see. So I created a page per overall. Oh, I didn't really introduce myself. I'm Laura. I'm a teacher librarian at Ridgemont High School. And I was a math teacher for many years. Well, still am a math teacher, but I'm not in the math classroom at the moment, but still very active in the thinking classroom community. And will bring lots of thinking classroom to other classrooms when I visit as the teacher librarian as well. So I created a document.
Uh-oh.
Organizer is what it would be, but basically just a table. And I would go through each overall expectation, and I sort of endeavored to keep each. So in the Ontario curriculum, we have in the MFM 2P, I think we had 9 overall expectations, and I endeavored to keep each one to 1 page. And so I created a table, and I put at the top in the table the keywords that students should know, be familiar with, and be able to use. Created it, I left them all blank, like at the top here in the keywords. And for so MFM 2P is an applied level math class. And And over time, I did find that my applied level students, when they did put examples, which often they just didn't, when they did put examples, for example, determine the scale factor, determine whether two triangles are samples that weren't appropriate for the topic, or mistakes. And because, as Karyn mentions, because I rely heavily on their meaningful notes later on in the course when we are working to solve problems at the boards, that was a bit problematic. So maybe I'm not as relaxed as I thought. So here's my A-type personality coming out. So for my applied learners, I chose to continue to leave blank totally for them to fill in the keywords, but I gave them worked examples in the course notes. And so I can show you a couple of pages here. I did put in formulas that would have normally appeared on a formula sheet. Those were always there for them. And I think this has, yes, I also included a trig table in there for them, as our graphing calculators that would do a lot of that work for them were starting to die. And I'm trying to see if there's anything else different along here. You can see some visuals when we got into quadratics. I used some very visual algebra tile examples. And I think, yeah, the last page was just some reminders of the sort of skills that overarch our curriculum documents. And I'll just go back to the very first page, which was an overview of, and it's sideways, I apologize, but just so that it can print properly, of the overall expectations for the course. And that first page I really liked because it was also on our wall as individual posters, and we referred to them at the end of each consolidation to have my students tell me what expectations we had covered in our problem solving. So this full course pack, it's like 10 pages long. It gets copied back to back, copied, stapled, and I give every student in the first 2 or 3 days their copy of this. It comes really early, as soon as we're into curriculum tasks. So they get their copy, it goes in their binder or they bring it with them. It's the only thing I really care about them bringing to class, other than a pencil, hopefully a calculator, if I can convince them. And after, as Karyn said, after each consolidation, we make sure we take the time for them to fill in. So we would do our consolidation. I would always say to them, okay, tell me which expectations we've been using or covering in the last day or two. So they would point them out, so if it's MT1 similar triangles, often it's multiple. And I would say, okay, take out your course pack and open to that page. And I want you to make some notes for yourself about what we've been learning. And what's great about the Thinking Classroom, and the course pack I found really drove this home, there were some expectations where our very first task covered literally the entire expectation. And I would just say to them, like, we've already done like a 1/9 of the course, like, an entire portion of the course in this one day. And that was really cool for them to see. I said, now we'll just practice it more until the end of the year. So that was always a really cool realization to them, that they knew everything in that, chapter, that expectation. So I'll show you, it's going to switch over here. My computer's lagging a bit. Rural internet fun. So the difference between that applied course pack and then an academic course pack, so it's going to switch over, is that I would leave it all blank for an academic course pack. So here's another example. So again, you can see on that first page, we've got the overview of all the expectations in the course in a really visual way. I guess that's the sketch note, visual note taker in me that likes those visuals. And so here you can see, again, you've got your expectation at the top, a table with the keywords that they need to know. And then as we go down, it starts to be into skills they should know, substitute into and evaluate algebraic expressions. And I've left that blank for the students to fill in. So giving students time after each consolidation to fill that in. And then one other sort of aspect that I like to incorporate early on, and I know it came up on Monday night in our book club chat, people were saying, well, you know, the students, they're so used to being given notes, they're really reluctant to write their own notes. They think they can't write the right thing. They really want someone to guide them with what to write. And that's for sure true. And yeah, the first time we do this, you know, there are a lot of students that don't put anything down. And so the first few times that we do it, especially when we've got an expectation where we've covered the entire page, and so they can have something in every box on a page, I like to do a gallery walk. So we do our consolidation. I give them time to fill in as many different boxes as they can. I also sort of give them the prompt that it would be great in every box if there were words, numbers, and pictures. So, you know, like some math, some words to describe things, annotating, some drawings, simple drawings, any formulas they might need. And so then I would have them, I would say, okay, put your pencils down, everybody stand up, leave your course pack open to whichever expectation we had done that day. And I have them walk around the room and I say, I want you to go and just look at every single other course pack on everybody else's desk. So they get, you know, 5 minutes, they wander around, they look at everybody else's course pack, and then we come back to our own desk and I say, okay, you've seen lots of ideas, you know, things that you might like that other people have added in terms of notes or just like the style of their notes. And so now I want you to take a few minutes and just add anything that you saw that was interesting into your own notes. And I find doing that gallery walk a few times at the beginning and then again at sort of periodic moments throughout the semester is just really helpful for the students that aren't really sure what to write to get an idea of what they could be writing. And so, yeah, eventually they have, you know, hopefully if they haven't lost the course pack at some point, they have this full, you know, 10-page document with all of their examples and definitions that they need. And then as Karyn pointed out, what's super important is actually that you make use of it and not just to study for a test. So you will often hear me when students are at the boards and they have a question or they're unsure how to proceed when their group. One of the very first things I'll always say is just, you know, have you looked in your course pack? Because usually we're building upon stuff that we've already done. They've got formulas in here, so they can, you know, refer to formulas. So I'll always say, you know, do you have your course pack? And they're in groups of 3, so, you know, always somebody doesn't have it, but, you know, hopefully in the group of 3, somebody's got a course pack. And it really starts to drive home the utility of filling it in because, you know, a kid might bring over their course pack and they have a section that's empty because they either didn't take notes that day or they were away. And then it's okay, well, who else in your group has, you know, a course pack and has that filled in? Who else can you go see to maybe see what they have in their course pack? Because hopefully other groups have their course pack. And my students do learn over time, they start to actually just bring their course pack over with them. And sometimes they just sort of lean it up against the whiteboard as they're working so that when they're ready for it, when they need it, it's there. So I found that really useful to refer back to what was in the course pack. We would look at worked examples to see if there was something similar on the page, any notes they had made to remind them. And so that's sort of how I do the course pack. I'm trying to think if there's any, I think that's about it. Karyn might can remind me if there was anything else I was gonna mention, but.
I don't think so.
So I don't know if folks have questions or if you guys want to share your amazing, meaningful note ideas.
So I might look back through the chat stream because I know people have been throwing questions up.
Yeah, sorry,
I know Karyn's been typing back at some of them too, so I've kind of lost track of which one she grabbed and which one she didn't.
That's okay. I grabbed the shorter ones because I feel like the ones that were more discussion based, I didn't want to answer like that.
I will try and make my way through them as well when my internet catches up with.
I think one theme that's come up that I found particularly interesting was when you say we want these notes to be to their future selves, at what point in the future is their self using it, and in what way?
So I can speak for what I do. I teach, and Laura does this too, but we spiral a curriculum. So we're going through concepts multiple times throughout the course, the same concept. So for me, I'm deliberately not teaching everything there is about a certain topic in a row. We're kind of timing it so that they do get a chance to forget it and remember it again. And so sometimes they'll see it in a different way. Sometimes it might just be like the next step. It depends. Sometimes just on my mood, but yeah, so that's the opportunity for them to look back again. So, we do a couple days of something and then we leave it, we do something else, then we come back to it. And so that way then they're actually having to use their notes. And then they learn it better because they're like revisiting it over and over and consolidating what they know about it.
Yeah, and I would say I would probably get through like 3 to 5 cycles, depending on the class. Like I've had some where we go slower and we only get through like 3 cycles. I get some where we can get through, 4 or 5 cycles of the curriculum. So building, to harder and harder tasks and examples within, a certain expectation. And so often I can sort of cover the whole expectation, but at a really sort of basic, sort of easier examples that I'm giving them, expecting them to be able to solve. And then the next time we come in, and it's a little bit like Peter in his book talks about that sort of ladder of, even within a lesson, you're building your ladder where sort of only one aspect of the problem changes and gets harder at a time as you build up your ladder. And so the next time I come back in the next cycle, I go to the next rung of that ladder as my first task, and then we keep building. And so, yeah, that's the future self that's got to refer back to, because maybe it's been, 3 or 4 weeks since we last looked at this. And so, pull out your course pack and remind ourselves what we did last time.
I think it's a good point. Reactivated was the word Karyn used earlier, but we know that knowledge gets built by retrieving information from basically a cold state. So you can use these notes intentionally in that way, which is what I find attractive about them. They actually become a tool for learning, not just a tool for copying the learning that we've already done. And then I know I'm gonna steal the spotlight a little bit, and I want to put the spotlight on Al. You do your course a little bit different, Al, because you do kind of that activity based, where you have an activity and that has elements of what you're expecting students to get. And then the next day you'll do a completely different activity, or the next week, but there's a lot of overlap between what you're trying to get students to take out of that in terms of the math and the learning. And I'm wondering if the notes students take about one particular thing, they actually pull out for a whole new activity that might superficially not look related. That's just a shot in the dark question.
It's interesting. Yeah. So like Laura and Karyn, I too spiral, right? So, and it's through, we try to do as many rich tasks as we can, but it's definitely, the tasks are more scaffolded early in the course. So like their notes, I would say, and I think I put this in the comments, that in grade 9 and 10 at our school, we tend to scaffold them more. We have course packets. Teachers give them more time in class to work on their notes, whereas we get them into grade 11 and 12, we're expecting them to do, that's their homework, to go home and figure out what did we do in class today, right? Like, this was really super messy. Their job is to go home and decipher it all. So like, we might do our gallery walk right up to the bell, or do our narrate our story right up to the bell, and then their job is to go home and pull out the key points and get it down on a piece of paper. I don't know if I answered your question though, Will.
It was a good answer either way, so I think we're all set.
Okay.
Another one that was in the chat, and I see Laura typed back to it. I think it was Adina or someone else had asked about, well, if we don't spiral, how can we how can we get them to make these notes become a tool that they use? So I don't know if that's something that wants to be addressed more in conversation, because I think that's one that's come up quite a bit.
I think it's a little less effective in terms of like the memory aspect of it and like giving that time to forget and remember. But I think if you're starting to create them when you're first learning a concept, you're going to be able to annotate them and make them richer as you learn more about the topic. So you're still going to be able to use them that way. I think it loses a bit of the richness though when you're not using it over a long period of time. But the other thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't think of saying before is like how powerful of a metacognitive tool this is for students to actually, especially when they go back and change what they have written as their note, because they're really thinking about what they're getting stuck on when they're trying to do a certain type of problem. So that's something that I've found really cool about it.
Someone asked about the younger grades, elementary. That is not I can't speak to that one myself, and I think Karyn and Laura now, and I know Peter likes to sit in the background, but the research did happen at the younger ages. I know in the book he says the 8-9 grade, the 8-9 years needed a little extra support with the structure, and then on either ends there was a little bit better natural. But if someone else can speak the elementary side, I certainly can't.
Hi, I'm happy to start a conversation about elementary, but I'm not an expert. But I'm in a Singapore school over in Singapore, which is why it's daylight here. And we start the idea of notes to our future house selves really with our like 5 and 6 year olds, but it's done virtually. It's through oral kind of note taking and discussions and things like that. And then as we get through further on, we look at how we can put those on the paper, and kind of lots of scaffolding about what visual tools we can use, what models we can use to help us. Sorry, my kids are loud in the background. Yeah, but I'd be really keen to hear others' ideas. We also spiral our curriculum. So we kind of come back when we're looking at different concepts. But it's been such a powerful way of documenting their learning and referring back to their learning, and also sharing their learning with everyone in their community, their parents, their friends in other classrooms, especially with our virtual environment at the moment. So, but I'd be, keen to hear more on that.
I'll say too, this, it's not piggybacking on the elementary, but I'm seeing sort of comments in the chat about like students struggling to know what to write. So one thing is that when I'm consolidating, I'm often annotating different groups' boards, and I try to always do that in a different color. And so sort of calling attention to some of those annotations, keywords, maybe whatever it's pointing to, where I've named strategies. Sometimes that can help sort of direct a student to things that they want to include.
Yeah, and I would add to that like I'm always doing this at a point where they have already written something down very recently that's related to the topic. They've solved a problem about what we want to take the note on. So they at least have the starting point of that problem still on their whiteboard that they've just finished solving. So if they can get that down and think of a couple of things that they think they might forget later, that's something they can build on later as they go through the course. So yeah, sometimes they don't know what they need to know later, and that's okay because they'll come back to it later and then they'll know what they didn't know.
And I've learned to just be okay that some of them won't
okay.
write anything, and I just don't stress about it anymore. Yeah. I don't know if there are, if people have questions that were further up in the chat that we haven't seen or addressed, feel free to just shout them out too.
Oh, somebody asked about assessments and using their notes. I'd say it depends. Depends on what the assessment is.
Yeah, I think if we were doing problem, like if I've done a mix of, you know, paper and pencil test, that was sort of where my next big shift was to come is in what I evaluated. So I did a mix of paper and pencil tests, and I had started toying with some of Al's work with group tests at whiteboards. And so if I were to be doing the group test at whiteboards, yeah, for sure, you know, to be using, and I'm trying to think, I might have actually let them have their course packs out in some paper and pencil tests too, because I know that the problems I'm giving them are rich on the test and they're not knowledge and understanding questions that I'm giving them there. They are problem solving. And I also adopted, I think it's Howie Hua's, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, model of like the 5-minute talking time with students, with classmates before we started a test too. So I would give them their paper and pencil test and we would read it over together, and which doesn't take very long because they're problem solving tasks, so they're not a million questions. And then I would give them 5 minutes to go talk to anybody they want in the class. They just couldn't write down anything. They just had to go chat, pencils down, no calculators, and then start their test. So if you're comfortable with it, go, you know, as they say, like we have to change our projects to make sure they're not Googleable. So you just make sure your test is not something that they can just copy and paste from their course pack or their meaningful notes. And why not let them, if that's what makes it meaningful for them, let them have it.
I'm seeing stuff about feedback on course notes. I would say I don't personally give feedback on their course notes other than to make them use them. So it's more about like create them. That's what I'm making them do, and then check back on them. And then the feedback is there anything you need to add to your note from before that will help you the next time you see this? So yeah, that's my feedback. I don't actually really care what they look at. I tried to find examples of notes that kids had done over the years, and I realized I had like one photo that I had taken because that's how much I actually look at them personally. It's more about the taking the time to actually make them meaningful to themselves.
Can I speak to that a little bit too, Karyn?
Yeah.
So that question about the accountability is an interesting one, Bonnie. It's one of the things that the research showed was that the majority of students were taking notes for their teacher, not for themselves, in a sort of normative setting, and so these notes were meaningless as opposed to meaningful, and mindless instead of mindful experiences, because they were really only writing them for the accountability of writing them. And that was one of the things that we realized, was that very few students were doing notes for themselves and in meaningful ways. So when it shifts to this, and this answers the next question, there are some students who won't write anything. Laura spoke about that, or they write very little, or they put in just a token effort. But you're still way ahead. The hard part is, how do we encourage them to write without turning this into an accountability issue? And I'll just tell this one brief story. And I can't remember if I told this the last time or not, but when Finland scored really well on the PISA, they formed a commission in Finland to try to figure out what they were doing right, because the world was coming and knocking on their door. And the person that they put in charge of this, or the spokesperson for this commission, was named Pasi Solberg. And he was asked a question. He was giving a presentation in the US, and he was asked a question about accountability measures in Finland. and he said, we don't have a word for accountability in the Finnish language. As far as I can tell, accountability is what's left when you take away responsibility. And like that statement has meant a lot to me as I thought about dealing with the data that was coming out of this. And I think that the question is much more about how do we have students be responsible than accountable. And I think Karyn's answer was right on. It's about getting them to use them in meaningful ways makes the notes something that they have to be responsible for rather than accountable for. And what we found was anything we did that even smelled of accountability, like you're going to hand in the notes so we can just look at them, it shifted and more students started writing the notes for the teacher again, rather than for themselves. So it's almost like accountability and responsibility are in tension with each other. And if you increase accountability, you decrease responsibility and vice versa.
This strikes me as overlapping quite a bit with the way homework is used, where it becomes something you do to show the teacher you did it and you could know it versus something the student does to check their own understanding for themselves, which of course then as these get kind of pieced together become a component of the broader culture and not just the individual items that we're discussing in these types of evening chats. So
I'll say like a lot of people are sort of wondering about like how to lead them into it. And I like Kevin's idea. Obviously the sketchnoter and me loves the idea of the group working together, maybe the first time to sort of come up with a summary note and then, you know, go back and write what you want of that, you know, so that you've got that group support, same as you had in your group problem solving. But I find like I give that course pack out really early on and we start to do that time. The expectation is they're putting those notes together. And as I've said, some of them don't. But I sort of give them that responsibility of those notes for themselves kind of right away. And for lots of them, it's really not a problem. And the ones that struggle with, I mean, they're reluctant maybe the first couple of times just because it's not what they're used to. And the ones that don't do it, they're not doing it because they don't really understand what they should be writing. They're the kids that were simply writing notes to mimic me and to do what I said because maybe I was going to check their notes or whatever. And so now they're not doing them. And those kids were never looking at them anyways. You know, and I remember like before I started these kind of notes, like I would tell the kids, like, take a picture of your board if you want to save it. And some kids do still, you know, but like I was kidding myself if I ever thought those kids put those photos of their boards anywhere organized, anywhere they would ever actually refer back to. So
I find I sometimes the first couple times I will scaffold the note-taking process a little bit, just like cueing them or things like that, like not telling them what to do, but if they're sitting there writing nothing, and this also goes to the fact that I have a very small class, so I can do this, but just like asking them some questions. Well, what do you think you might want to, like, what do you think you might need to know next time? Or like, what are some mistakes that you keep making when you're doing this, or things like that. And that helps. But I think the most motivating thing is having them come across the problem, like a different problem again. And my cue being, hey, where are your notes? And then they realize, oh, wow, I have to use them. So that's, I don't know, that's the best part of it.
I'll just pop it. So somebody was saying, like, how does spiraling save time? And Al, if Al's still there, would be great to speak to. Is Al still with us?
He's just typed in the chat.
Yeah,
so
I was typing in the chat, but yeah.
You should
So
speak to spiraling.
the first time I tried spiraling, whoops, I'm muted. Am I muted?
Nope, you're good.
No, you're good.
The first time I tried spiraling, I was astonished that we got to 3/4 the way through the course, and we had kind of developed all the curriculum and just done activities. And then it was like, okay, we have like 1/4 of our course left. And I feel like we've covered almost everything we need to cover. So then all of a sudden it's like, okay, now we can like really dig in and do some really rich tasks. And I would comment, if you are going to spiral out, that's kind of the way to go. Like, do small little things early, try to suck as much curriculum out of the activity as you can. And then as you move on, you can throw an open-ended activity at them and see what happens with it. And so like, I think once you get the ideas, and a lot of times they'll take the ideas that you have shown them and they'll go deeper with them in these activities. So yeah, what ends up happening is that lo and behold, you have all this time at the end of your course to dig deeper. So that's kind of the nice thing about it. Like I feel like we do these units. We used to do these units, or I used to do these units, and it would be like we're taking the whole kindergarten class across the street at the same time. And it's just not the reality of it. They're all learning at their own pace, and some of them they have different gaps. And so like, it's just this ability, and the thinking classroom model is great for this. It's just this ability to let kids go further with a problem. And with other kids, you can fill the gaps in during the problem, and it's all in the same classroom at the same period. So yeah.
Well, and I do think that it's hard to talk about these things as individual items. I mean, obviously these are individual elements, but they do inform a larger experience for the students. And so I think one of the biggest payoffs is when you start taking away the cheap, opportunities for success. The artificial success of getting I got full marks because I turned it in on time. If you remove all of that kind of stuff, and what's left is something that's helping them achieve an end in a real way, everything becomes valuable, because they can't cover it up with the cheap wins. So you got to take away that superficial nature of things.
And I'll add to that. Like, I think when we do teaching units and we get them to write a test and they all cram for it and they memorize all these algorithms or whatever it is they have to do for them. And, they write a pretty good test, and you feel good about yourself and the kids feel good about themselves. And then you ask them a question about that unit in 4 weeks, and they probably can't do it. It's like, did they really learn it? So, I just find coming back to it and strengthening the pathways in the brain, a little bit more sticks over the course of the course than might happen teaching in blocks. And so, for you, mindful notes like that, that's another thing though, right? Like, that's another way for them to strengthen the pathway, by them going back and looking at it and going, oh yeah, right, okay, and them having to recall it. So I think they're totally useful. And I don't lay it out for my kids in any way, shape, or form. I'm always asking them to go home and make their mindful notes. Like, that's kind of their homework.
Okay, I'm seeing, how do you keep the learning a surprise? Oh, my applied learners, they're not reading the course pack ahead of time. They're not pre-reading stuff at all. Even no, that's not a problem. And then the academics, it's blank. So they have to fill it in for them. So it hasn't been a problem. And if they, honestly, like, if a kid learns something ahead of time, kudos to them. Then they're the expert in their group when that comes up that day, and they're going to feel real proud of themselves.
I guess that if I can speak, I guess there's different pathways to learning and different things that I've read in terms of going through and learning a particular concept, that surprise, that aha moment, that discovery, where you're taking away the formulaic kind of factual aspect of it. That's what I like to do. So I kind of help them build their conceptual knowledge, whatever, as much as possible. I know there's areas where there's not. And so in terms of giving that information, I can see for some groups of my students, definitely a big positive that would really help them with the scaffolding. But other groups, I want them to go through and discover how to factor quadratics without having to tell them how to factor quadratics or whatever that might be. So that's what I meant by that question. But
Yeah.
I totally get you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would say in my experience for the classes where I've given them the worked examples, they are just as shocked by the first time they factor a quadratic, as anybody else that hasn't seen what's in that course pack.
So Bonnie, what you said there is wonderful. And this is one of the things that if you start to think about notes in a sort of conventional setting versus these meaningful notes, in a conventional setting, notes are the activity. Whereas for Laura and Karyn, notes is a reification of the activity. So the activity happens and then the notes is what comes after as something that students produce in a meaningful way to capture the essence of what it was that they had just discovered. And so the discovery process is still there. Like if you spend time in Alex's or Laura's class, these students are exploring and experiencing and having aha moments constantly. And then there's that consolidation, but then that sitting down and writing the meaningful notes is a way for them to sort of create a record and some meaning out of that really powerful personal experience.
Okay, then I misunderstood then, because again, I'm a little behind on reading your book. So in terms of going through, that's exactly what I kind of go through. I go through that exploration, investigation, hands-on, whatever. We play with the math, and then we come. Okay, so that's where in my head I was getting it reversed. Okay.
And the note is like the starting point for next time, right? So then like when you take it deeper, this is the stuff they already know and they're having to remember that stuff to do the next thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And Laura's pack is really just
Yeah.
an organizer for them to organize these ideas.
Right.
And it was interesting. One of the things I found was that older students aren't necessarily better at this. Like just because they're in grade 11, we can't assume that they can do it right off the hop if they haven't had these experiences before. But so you have to provide some scaffolding or some structure or some help to begin with. It's just that older students are quicker to learn it.
And I'll say too, Bonnie, like you were saying, you're concerned that it would remove that aha moment. That's based on the idea that a student looking at my worked example understands it at a deep level and can have that same aha moment. And for most students, they're not going to take a look at that worked example and really understand everything that's written there. So they have to experience the problem solving in their group where I've carefully selected the tasks and that ladder that Peter goes through of, of increasing the difficulty on each, task that I give them to extend. And so, yeah, I don't find that it removes any of the great discovery and self-accomplishment that you're looking for with your tasks.
Thank you. Makes much more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I can remember by personal experience with notes. This is why the notes section of Building Peaks in Classrooms jumped out to me so much, because I can remember I was that kid who never took notes in any class ever in high school through most of my university time at Michigan State. And then I went to KU and got my math degree. And I learned real quick the value of notes, but it was only because it was kind of like what Peter was saying, I guess, kind of the concretization of my own thoughts that I needed to capture. There was a lot going on. I needed to get them down. I needed to organize them and revisit them when I can piece through them part by part. So, the meaningfulness of them, they were entirely mine. I'm sure I was taking examples and copying what the lecturer said, but most of the notes that I used for my own learning when I was getting my math degree were the notes I was writing to myself on the sides of the worked examples as the professor was lecturing, because that's where I was attaching to it and asking questions of myself to return to. So the notes section definitely jumped out at me in this framework.
David is sort of asking about course outlines and communicating with the parents. I'll fully admit that I just stopped giving out to like the old course outline that no one ever looks at because it looks exactly the same for every course the kids are taking. I have like a parent letter that explains some of the things I need them to know, like where to access our course materials online and some things like that. And then I had the course pack. When I give it out to students, you can see it in that PDF, also goes to our virtual classroom space. So if they do want to see the curriculum expectations, they're all there. So the course outline wasn't so much an issue, David, but I've definitely had conversations with parents that are concerned about how I teach, and concerned that I'm not teaching, or, you know, that definitely comes up, or kids that will say, but you don't teach because I don't stand up at the front and give notes. I'll say one thing that was important was to be really open with my admin team about what I'm doing. Door open, invite them to come in and watch what we do, participate, and they always felt really confident, you know, like, you know, they would listen to my students at the end of a lesson, you know, point at the posters on our wall to say which curriculum expectations we had just covered that day. And I think it's often rare in a classroom to find a kid that can point to where in the curriculum they're actually currently learning. And I'm lucky that a lot of my admin also, or at least there's always like one admin who's active on Twitter and will follow me and will see then all the things I'm doing and sharing via Twitter too. So by having them in my physical classroom space, by having them follow my Twitter feed and my blog, I've been very lucky that my admin has always backed me up fully. And I justify with all the great research that's out there. I talk to the parents about how we're solving problems, that instead of just copying notes, you know, I tell them all the things that we all know why just copying notes would be terrible, and why, you know, solving problems, working in the group, you know, all of that stuff, why that's important. So yeah, that does, I do have some parents that I have to have those conversations with at parent-teacher interviews sometimes, or by email ahead of parent-teacher interviews.
I'm curious if anyone in here knows of someone who does building thinking classroom framework, but uses an already established note-taking system like a Cornell Notes or you know, anything else, because my school is very invested in Cornell Notes, very invested indeed. And I've never used them myself, but now I'm trying to figure out if there's a way I can bridge the gap and find them on a common ground. So I'm curious if anyone knows. I mean, if it works, it works. I'm just curious if anyone's seen this work.
I see the question, what are Cornell Notes? And I also have that question. So people are Googling it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the expert. Like I said, I've never used it, but it's this idea that there's a portion of the page, usually on the left, that's dedicated to some sort of note-taking activity like student questions. And then there's a portion down the other 2/3 column that is fairly, I don't know, structured or dictated, really guided. And if I'm mistaken on that, someone else can jump in. Like I said, I'm not overly familiar with it. I just know it's been all the buzz around here. Kansas might be a decade behind everyone too. I don't know.
I feel like it could be a structure that could be useful to some people, but I feel like the second that you impose a structure, then you're taking away that autonomy, right? So I don't know.
So Cornell Notes for me in my world is an example of how can we do something innovative while not changing anything, right? and that's sort of, and I bump into this in education a lot, because 70% of that page is dedicated to notes exactly the way we've been doing it all along. So we still get to do the thing that's always the same. And then we'll just add this little twist where the student writes some notes to themselves or reflects on things. And I'm saying, like, that's a good thing. That 30% thing is a good thing. But it is an example of how can we rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic to try to squeeze one little bit more learning out of something that just has been around for 150 years without actually asking ourselves, could it look different?
Yeah, I always like it when it's like, well, we'll give them a little bit of space to ask their own questions. I'm like, yeah, we should do that for them. Give them a little bit of space to have a thought for themselves.
Is that something in, I mean, that's one part of Cornell Notes that I do like, that I can integrate, and I don't dictate it to my students, but I encourage it however they want to put it. I say, you can want to put it on the right-hand side, left hand, the bottom, I don't care. Because I have, there's a program, I don't know if it's an American thing called AVID. It's an acronym, I don't even know what it stands for. And they're really, really, really big on Cornell Notes. So the kids that are in that program, that are in my class, have to keep this huge binder, and I think it's ridiculous, to be honest with you. But you know, they have to do it. But I like to kind of take that part. Is that something that, how would you integrate that into like being open-ended with the students in terms of asking and being reflective? Because I think that's an important part, an important skill for our students to kind of learn. Does that make any sense?
Is that a general question, or was that?
Just a general question. I just like, I've struggled with how to make my students more reflective, because they're not, and it's like, okay, we're done with this and now let's move on. Okay, but let's think about what you did get, what you didn't get, what do we know to go forward, and they just kind of want to move forward no matter what. And I'm struggling in terms of, I try to have them write at their notes or somewhere, or you know, discussions or however, but that's where I'm trying to figure out. I'm not, does anybody have any ideas?
So the question is, or my question to you would be, how are they going to use those notes later?
Mhm.
And if you figure that out, then they're going to be more meaningful to them.
I don't know that the format of the notes matters so much. Like
No.
if they have to take Cornell notes, let them take Cornell notes, as long as they're putting down the information that they found useful, that they want to remember for future problems. If, on the other hand, you're saying you want them to reflect on maybe where their strengths and weaknesses are, that can be a separate activity. It doesn't have to be part of the meaningful notes. So I know we use something called evidence records. So it's basically a standard-based grading visual overview of their achievement on each overall expectation. And throughout the course, I will send them email or print out their evidence records. And I have them just do a quick little reflection, you know, what expectations do you need some practice with before we can achieve a higher level? Which ones are you really strong with? What, level do you think you're getting overall? I do that right before report cards. So that way I can see, like, when a kid says they think they're getting a level 3 and they're like in the level 1s, I'm like, okay, ooh, we got to have a conversation. So that's where I use the reflection. I don't, the notes and the reflection, I don't think have to be at the same time. So if the reflection is important to you, I think there's room for that.
That's where I think I was trying to, or I thought that would be a place to put it, but now that you mentioned that, I think it is to keep it separate. I think that's something that'll work.
Alice saying in the chat too, lots of things like exit tickets, portfolios, reflection questions. Yeah, so lots of opportunities for those kind of questions to be in there.
Interviews
Portfolios.
too.
I can tell a bit of a funny story that came out of the research. When I started doing this research on notes, the first thing I did was I looked at how effective, and I talk about this in the book, how effective is note-taking currently, like having students sit and I write, you write. And it was a disaster, right? Like the data was saying like, this is not good. So, and in fact, it isn't just that it's not good, it's actually detrimental to thinking. So that 30 minutes of having the students sit there and write was sucking thinking time out of the class. And so how do we improve on that? Well, the easiest way to improve on that is we're just going to stop doing notes. Like that was gone. And we actually saw a whole bunch of improvements now because we had lots more time and so on. And that's sort of where I stopped thinking about it, right? I said, well, that's it. We've solved it. The solution to the best way to do notes is to do no notes. And what was interesting when I was doing some workshops around thinking classrooms, and I would say that 50% of the teachers just said, okay, I'm out. Not interested. That the idea of not doing notes was, or students not having notes, I think was a bigger issue, was a deal breaker. And it was an interesting experience for me that I had a result that was better than doing notes, but the result wasn't satisfactory to the practitioners, right? So it was like the practitioners pushed back at me, and it was kind of like, and I don't talk about this in the book, but it's like, okay, back to the drawing board. So then it was like, okay, let's start talking to kids. Let's start talking to teachers. What is it about notes that are important? Why? And then emerged out of this the idea of meaningful notes. But it was the only practice that I engaged in where it was like doing nothing was better than what was currently happening.
Wow. Well, and I ask my kids, like, I don't know if you guys have, you know, if you, there might be some people watching that are still keen on writing notes and having kids copy them. I know that used to be me. And so I have asked students, and this might speak to, I think it was David's question earlier about like the pushback from parents, but I also get pushback from kids sometimes. Like Rob, I think, was saying, like, it's that you're a champion if you know, 3 weeks in they go, yeah, but when are we going to start learning? So I'll get pushback from students that say, like, oh, but you don't teach and we're not really doing math. And so, you know, I lost my train of thought. So I'll come back to you.
Traditional notes versus not
Oh,
traditional
yeah.
notes.
So I always say, so when they bring that up and they push back, I just sort of say, okay, well, in like when you copy notes from a teacher, like, because some of them will say like, oh, I really need those notes copied. I have kids say that, you know, I need that. That's my style. I'm like, okay, you know, and I say, like, put up your hand if you are listening to your teacher while you copy. And most students will admit that they cannot do both. They cannot copy word for word what's being written on the board and listen to what the teacher is saying. So first of all, these teachers that are like writing notes and they turn and talk to the kids while the kids are still writing down what they just wrote. They're not listening to a thing. And I said, like, how many of you actually read what you're copying, like, as like that are understanding, not just like understanding, but also just even just reading it as a start? Like, how many of you are actually reading it as you write it? And how many of you understand? And they all say, you know, like 99% of them say no to that as well. So, and that, yeah, and we leave it at that. And that was hard for me to come to terms with because I was an excellent studenting mimicker. It was all about all those studenting behaviors that Peter researches. I was real good. Oh, Michael's got a good question about the
IEPs.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Gosh, I write lots of IEPs, but I don't think that I've ever put that in somebody's IEP. So now I'm like,
I don't think I've seen it in the IEPs myself, and I've never had it requested from my students or the LST teacher working with them.
Like, I would say if oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it's probably one of the most common things I see in an IEP.
Oh, that's fascinating.
I think because it's an easy one. And so it's like, we can just do this for the kid and say, you know, there's their IEP.
So I would say that there's plenty of accommodations that can be made in terms of their note taking, in terms of speech to text, in terms of using a computer, in terms of having extra time to make their notes, like all of these things that they actually might need for their executive functioning. And if they have like a learning disability or ADHD or something like that. But I still think that in some way or shape or form that it's important for them to work on those notes. So I think that might be a conversation with like whatever spec ed teacher is creating that IEP, because when you're creating an IEP, you're looking at psych ed reports and stuff like that, and they make recommendations, but they don't necessarily, like, you can choose what's actually effective for the student. So that's what I would say on that one.
I've yet to fail at getting it worded that says, one, the student has to attempt making notes for themselves first. That's a condition of getting notes from someone else. And then, you know, if they're able to do so. And then the other condition is they actually can find a peer who's willing to share their notes with that student. And usually I can get both those met. And most of the time the student doesn't attempt to take notes. So it's moot.
I've worked with several teachers who, in these circumstances, just post on their website a set of notes. And they're not like Laura's course pack. It's not the course pack filled in. It's just notes that they used when they taught the course 3 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
So the notes are there. And that sort of solves a couple of problems. One is if a student has an IEP where they're not supposed to write notes, they can download the notes. They're there, right? And it also solves the issue if a student is away and they miss something, the notes are there. And it serves our third really important purpose, which was alluded to earlier, is that it actually makes parents think you're doing your job, which is because it looks familiar to them, right? What's interesting is almost no students will bother downloading the notes. They're there and they're a backstop for these situations, but other students aren't downloading them because you have created value in the process of meaningful note-taking, right? And it turns into a metacognitive activity, as Karyn talked about earlier.
Yeah, I think they can be heavily accommodated. I think, but I think them being an active part in the creating that is the really important part. So you can be super creative with that, right? But I've all of my students are on IEPs and they do this, and whether yeah, it's fine.
So again, the IEP recommendation comes back to this idea of a very static image of what a classroom looks like, where note-taking happens simultaneous to instruction, right? And in a world where those two things are happening at the same time, removing the note-taking reduces a cognitive load and gives a student who has an IEP an opportunity to pay attention. But I think, Karyn, the reason you're not having issues with this is because in a thinking classroom, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? Meaningful note-taking is something that happens without the distraction of instruction. It happens in a sort of special time in the lesson.
Well, I think it's important to decouple this notion that instruction and learning are the same thing too. You know, I can talk at you all day and you can take lots of notes, but if you learned anything, that's a separate question. Versus if you do a bunch of learning and then I say, hey, let's pause for a minute and reflect on what just happened. Now those notes are actually a reflection of the learning that's happened, not the instruction that's happened. And I think that's maybe why it becomes irrelevant in terms of an IEP, and it solves the cognitive load issue because you're keeping it partitioned the way it should be. Learning now, reflecting on learning afterwards. And I'm not trying to balance both those simultaneously. It also, yeah, notes don't equal learning. That's the big thing. If people think you're taking notes, that's the lesson.
In many ways, notes has become a proxy for learning. It in the sense that it somehow stands in place of learning, but it isn't learning in a conventional setting.
I'm just throwing in the chat. So about and this goes back to the parent pushback. It's a little bit similar with student pushback. So I shared a sketch note, and I will share a link to a blog post I wrote that hopefully has the link to the original article in it. And it's about how students are actually really terrible judges of their own like of when they're learning. It's, you know, that like they feel like they're learning when they have that sort of old chalk and talk. But if you actually do the research to see where they've learned better, it's not in that chalk and talk model. It's in something like this, a Thinking Classroom, an engaging, active learning environment. And the research bears it out that the students feel like they're learning better, even if they're not actually learning better.
It seems like the questions are starting to kind of slow down, and it is 8:50 or 9:50 or 9:50 Eastern. Is this a good time to start wrapping it up, or are there still some questions before we suspend this? All right, hearing no objections. Karyn, Laura, anything from you?
Thank
I
you so
think
much.
we're good. Thanks.
All
And
right.
I mean, both of us are pretty happy to answer questions in general. So
Email us, find us on Twitter, wherever,
yeah.
on the socials.
Well, I'm very appreciative of you two for you know, giving us your time and energy. So thank you so much. I'm kind of leading the session, and thank you to everyone for attending as always. Again, the next one is scheduled for February 25th. I've already forgotten what the topic is. I think it might be assessment. I'm losing track between all the things I'm up to. So,
yeah, it's assessment.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Carmen is one of those people who, and Aaron, who's here, I
Yes,
think.
yes.
Yeah, and Aaron as well, who's I
You
see
got
him
it.
here. So they'll be here 2 weeks in a day. So have a good night, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.